Hey poets, I'm going to be presenting on Grace Nichols, and I'm going to begin reciting a piece called Skin Teeth from her earliest collection published in 1983. I is a long memoried woman. Skin Teeth. Not every skin teeth is a smile, massa. If you see me smiling when you pass, if you see me bending when you ask, know that I smile. Know that I bend only the better to rise and strike again. This second piece is called With Apologies to Hamlet, and it's from her publication, Lazy Thoughts of a Lazy Woman, published in 1989. It's a bit ironic and humorous. With apologies to Hamlet. To pee or not to pee, that is the question. Whether it's sensibler in the mind to suffer for sake of verse, the discomforting slings of a full and pressing bladder, or to break poetic thought for Lou as a course of matter, and by appeasing and it. And this final poem comes from Startling the Flying Fish, published in 2006, and it is called Rain Music. The sleep-inducing rain beating down on the galvanized is just Iron Man Ogun turning his hand to steel pan. The clatter of wind in the trees is just Oya scattering her vocals among an acoustics of leaves. The rolling and receding thunder is just Shango hitting his old drum kit with some new lightning riffs. Before we closely look at her work, I need to make mention that Grace Nichol is an acclaimed Caribbean poet, born and educated in Guyana, and lives in the UK much of her adult life. She's very interested in exploring topics that embraces, quote, the power of memory, linkages to mythology and history, dreams, landscapes, and the imagination. Much of her writing touches on this post-colonial world, or the conversation between the UK and the Caribbean and countries alike. So in Skin Teeth, the first thing you must recognize in my culture, in Caribbean culture, in Nichols' culture, skin teeth is typically used as a reference to laughing, smiling, big mouth, grinning with your teeth, all teeth. And so when we enter this poem, there is this sense of body language that is being communicated automatically. This poem is relatively short, with 4 strophes, 3 couplets followed by a quintet at the end. In its last line, there's 1 word, and it is again. The poem speaks directly to the character of Massa, or otherwise master, but it seems to defy the relationship between what would originally be master and servant, or otherwise, as one that is resistant to that sort of relationship, that sort of bondage, that sort of connection between the two in that way. And this is implied with the uses of you in line 4 and 6, as well as I in 7 and 8, and me in line 3, because the narrative voice is very present, where they're talking directly to this character of Massa. So you see that exchange there. The rhyme scheme here, it doesn't seem to follow the technical rhyme schemes in terms of line patterns, A, B, A B, CD, CD, and so forth. But instead, I think because the lines are so short and spread out, that we tend to get the rhymes between sentences, between strophes versus um, each line. And we see that visually with smiling and bending with the ends of the ing, but also sonically with the pass and the ass, those kind of slight rhymes, but you hear it. And of course, the bend and again. Ending on again is very provocative. It brings up this sort of continuum. This is a poem that wants to play on the historicizing nature of peoples. With the use of massa, we get a very outdated lingo that sets us in a specific period when we're thinking about servitude or we're thinking about slavery. Um, but it seems to want to move towards uprising, a sort of pushing back against those doctrines. And we see that in the last strophe with the anaphora: know that I smile, know that I bend, only the better to rise and strike. We have the image of rise and strike, especially on that line where one would tend to hear rise and shine. So I think she's very clever there. But rise and strike, you have this resistance, this violent image, this consequential image, in which she is putting forth for us to imagine in this conversation. The imagery of the paired bending and the smiling, I think that was very smart as well. As well as, themes of suppression and expression, freedom of expression, and of course historical genderizations. Who gets to be called massa? There's a lot we can definitely go on with that, but I'm going to jump right ahead to with apologies to Hamlet, which immediately is a very intertextual poem. We see it in the reference to the title, where Nichols is purposely referencing Shakespeare's sonnets, although she takes her own liberties. It looks nothing in terms of line length. She takes a lighter approach, one that invokes a sort of lightness, a sort of humor, where she asks, instead of the existential question to be or not to be, she says to pee. And she goes back and forth with the conflicting ideas of peeing versus writing poetry, and it becomes a very comical, but still very endearing, I think, especially as writers. There's a lot, like I said, of irony, but it strips, I think, away some of the seriousness of which Hamlet's monologue is designed to poke at. By the end of the poem, Nichols uses the word appeasing, to which she puts a hyphen. Very well done, because again she plays on the to pee or not to pee, but also brings us back to a very political poem, in which the word appeasing directly relates to one, diplomatic policy, or material consensus, to an aggressive power in order to avoid conflict, or to pacify or placate someone by acceding to their demands or relieve or satisfy. So this is a very weighty poem, and in that way it is working in the realm of postcolonialism, in writing back to colonial narratives where Hamlet gets the last say, or in that monologue at least, and Um, in Nichols' poem, she follows that structure, that kind of scansion, prosody, if you will. In some lines, the two or not two, that is the question, whether it's in the mind to suffer, which are all reflected and mimicked from Hamlet's piece, which puts it in conversation with it, but she does not stay to the measure. His poem is very abridged, with two couplets followed by the septet, and still remains, though, in a very meditative, contemplative style, the soliloquy form in which Shakespeare writes. Um, it's definitely worth diving into some more for sure, especially looking at the ways in which the couplets are kind of set aside, and we have the idea of peeing, but then we enter into the poem with new mind, right, a sensibler mind, which I can't be too sure if that's a real word, but in this context, whether or not it is, because it could very well be or not, it makes sense. And I think that's part of what her writing does. It is that discomfort that she talks about in line 5, of language, of words, which draws us more to it, which makes us want to press against our bladders, but also coming to a consensus about where it is we stand. And I think that that's what her writing is doing, coming to a consensus about where it is she stands. Moving lastly to rain music, I want to focus a lot on content versus the style that we've seen in the last poem. Um, because it's evidential that this poem references African and Caribbean gods. You must know Ogun, Oya, and Shango, usually paired together, but specifically that Ogun comes out of the Nigerian tradition, as well as Benin, Latin America, Haiti, and is the god of metal and rum making. Oya is paired usually with Shango and comes out of the Yoruba tradition, both Oya and Shango, which was brought over to the Caribbean. And so Oya is the goddess of strong winds that precedes the thunderstorms, and Shango is the Orisha of fire, thunder, lightning bolts, which we see in here. But this is really a poem about myth making, where Nichols incorporates these spirited beings, these gods, into the narrative structure, and she imagines the sound of rain, to which is musical because of these goddesses. Um, the gods are seen as this sort of rhythmic sensation, where Ogun turns his hands to steel pan, Oya's vocals scatter amongst acoustic leaves, Shango's drums with lightning riffs on lines 3, 6, and 9. She uses musical terminology with the acoustics, the riffs, paired with the gods and their power, or what they're known for. The poem begins with the rain being described as sleep inducing. I thought, wow, that compound right there, sleep inducing, because it's followed in the next line by the words beating down. And so I think there are ways that she plays on that forcefulness, the paradoxes. I was trying to pick up on the word galvanize, which is a verb, but is it used as a noun here? But again, that's playing with the language. And steel pan, of course, is a reference to soca, calypso, reggae music in the Caribbean. Clatter is used to reemphasize sound, the continuous wind. In line 8, the rolling and receding forms this pattern, this rhythm of the riff, which is also part of what a drum riff does. It's important to look at the way that water as well is essential to this poem that is about rain. the way that it's both powerful but instrumental as well. And I mean that in terms of its fundament, this connection between continental locations, right, in these diasporas with the gods, but also in its instrumental musicality in that way as well. So the thematic consistency produces rhythm and sound within each of these lines. I really wish I could spend a lot more time with Grace Nichols and really delve into this, because she does a lot when she plays. One of the most important things is that she talks about the way she's focused on the memory of sound. And so in order to understand, and although my thoughts align, these are her words, that you have to hear her. And so I spent a lot of time reading not only her work, but listening to her read it, because many of the times she spoke about it, whether it was poems that were similar in nature, that were written around a certain time, that was written due to a certain event, or writing back to, which we see in some of the poems here. So needless to say, I had a great time learning more about her poetry, and this letter is dedicated to her. Hi, Miss Grace. How are you doing? I saw on the news last month that there was one sure case of COVID-19 in Guyana that was brought in during a resident's return to our country. I hope your family there is safe and well. Unfortunately, these days have been feeling inconclusive, uncertain, and very faintly unsolvable. Despite the rampant chaos around us, though, it has felt good reading your poetry at night and listening to you read from your collections midday. I think you will agree with me that this madness, this sudden outbreak, the French doctors wanting to test vaccines in Africa, the minimum wage store workers carrying on with no benefits, the families and residents who have lost their jobs and still owe rent, all of that madness, at the very least, has forcibly shined light on the disproportionate healthcare and economic systems in place. Everything you write about, everything I write about, is publicly unfolding, sadly. With that said, I hope you and Mr. Agar are staying well and still choosing to put your pen onto the page, because I consider that even if poetry doesn't save our health, it's the one proof the world has of our lives. Forgive me if this letter seems consumed with a host of thoughts and ideas. The last letter I wrote was a month ago to a 19-year young child who I met in St. Louis County Jail when she was 16. So I'm filled with worry all over. I think now is no better time than none to share my appreciation for your poetry and all that it has shaped for the kind of poetry I write. And for those of young Caribbean poets and those who have migrated from our home country to others that still live in countries that once owned ours, or owned small countries like ours. When we consider what the voyage of art is, the voyage we see in our lives, it is unmistaken how poetry reaches the world around it. In your poetry, I observe that you are concerned with the world around you and conscious of the ways readers will learn about this world or these worlds throughout your works. I admire how bluntly you take on the subject of race, Black womanhood, and transnationality in your poems. In the Fat Black Woman's poems, you praise the fat Black woman and her body. You create and personify this being, which is separate from the physicality of the author, and allow it to possess us and command authority over us in the time we spend reading. This woman you write of radiates confidence, humor, and divine sexuality within her. Although the world, her country, can merely look at her and see something more than a fat black woman, an immigrant, a person in poverty, all of which is assumed. In my own poetry, I try to personify cultural things I remember from memory and figure there's no point trying to forget, and things I try to piece together from that memory and my current life in the States. I write a lot of poems about the sea. You talk about the ocean, but I think both words in our cases are exchangeable. I have multiple poems about the sea, but coming to terms with this common interest in my work that showcased itself amongst many Caribbean and diasporic writers was new. I remember identifying how it became a marker of passage, a representation of landscape, and a means to an origin elsewhere. I wanted to personify that in a poem, so I thought of the sea as an elder, as a little old lady, wrinkled old lady, with great stories and great wisdom, who has buried many bodies, and who is an omniscient voice that knows all. After all, she was here first. I think we have similarities when it comes to content, and loosely for myself, the narrative voice and style. For many years, I asked myself the question of whose writing most influences my work, which is a question that is separate from whose writing do I purely enjoy or whose writing do I mostly read. When I began spending more time with my own words, it became bright and it became clear. I write in the tradition of you, Miss Grace. I write in the tradition of writers like you, Miller, Brathwaite, Shirley. I write and carry on the legacies of Caribbean writers, particularly those who are concerned with displacement, those who practice radical womanhood, those who believe in self-love and black love, those whose activism lives in literary and social communities across the globes, those whose storytelling is linked to Creole language, folklore, Africa's diasporas, and history, those who practice fearlessness through words, those who utter as they write and say the finished product out loud, those who make up words and assign them to a catchy rhythm, and those whose poetry cannot live without ever being heard. After closely engaging with you in your writing for the past several months, I have found myself, for the first time in a very long time, enjoying rhymes. I learned from writers like you, as well as others I read growing up in America, such as Clifton, Giovanni, Murray Evans, and others, that poetry is witty. From reading and paying critical attention to your works over the last 25 to 30 years, I learned that we can use poems we have read many times before to write back to them, to rewrite them as we see fit, and use them to make commentary of the world or of the poet as we wish. When I listen to you talk about the works and the events and the circumstances that inspire a poem, I realize that poetry is research. When I hear you speak, I sense the excitement you get from writing, and that you perhaps prioritize when writing this kind of excitement. I recently heard that writing poetry doesn't always make you happy, and with my sensitivity, I agree. Yet, when I hear you speak about your poetry, it's less about feeling during the writing process and more about pride in the outcome. I wonder if it's difficult for you to write the kinds of poems that you do, or is it more of a remedy, an imaginary world where we get to be seen exactly how we wish the world to see us, to see people? I also wonder how you know when to stop editing. How do you know if a poem is too short, too long, too similar to something you have written already? Through my poetry, I'm concerned with the cultural and ethnological functions of language. Similarly, I think about this video I once watched on Jamaica deciding to nationalize patois. how even those who were fluent speakers debated on what is a written language and what would that look like in patois. It made me think about scholarly practices that engage with both oral and written languages. I'm reminded of Miller's poem, Speaking in Tongues, where he says, "What is language but a sound we christen? Your words seem to manage its own self-baptism. It lives on. The delicacy of your words reminds me of Angelou, who said, I believe words are things. I believe it goes up into the upholstery, then into the rugs, into my hair, into my clothes, and finally into my body." In a recent Zoom seminar with Richard Lawson about causative routines during this pandemic, I asked, what are we as writers supposed to do as we try to get our work out there in a time like this? Of course, I know he isn't a writer, so I didn't expect much of a direct answer. I figured my job was to keep writing, to document not only the current state, but my current state. But he did offer some advice. He said that it's time to organize the 4 different kinds of people in our lives. The ones you go to dinner with, the ones you support, the ones that support you, the ones you know really well, and then the ones you don't know at all but really want them to know you. He said, write it out, set your list, and do something with it. So, Miss Grace, I would love to talk to you more about your writing. I would love and be happy to share some of mine. Maybe you can listen to me recite Skin Teeth, or perhaps reminisce about your childhood and education in Guyana, or simply talk about how you make pepper pot. I hope that this letter finds you with love. Sincerely, Carmen. It's been a pleasure.